Okay, welcome everybody. Andy, if I can ask you to turn your video back on so that we have you as well live. Perfect.
Hi, Charlie.
Ooh, we don't seem to have your video. I don't know why that is. Can you switch it off again and switch back on? Sorry, Andy.
Let me try that. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. We just have a black box for the video. I'm not sure why that is. Okay. There we go.
Is that better?
It's just taking a minute. One of
those
downsides of doing everything by digital now, and that slight panic of, is it going to come back? Anyway, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what I think will be a fascinating discussion with Andy Haldane, Chief Economist, of course, from the Bank of England. Obviously fascinating from the fact that we are in the middle of an economic crisis, a very uncertain trajectory forward, although perhaps the vaccine news today, I don't think any of us have had quite a chance to have looked at it in detail, but perhaps that gives a bit more certainty or a bit more hope, at least, going forward. But to have the Chief Economist of the Bank of England at a time like this is obviously brilliant. But actually more than that, because, and hopefully sparing Andy's blushes, Andy is also a kind of one of the most interesting thinkers on the broader context in which the economy operates. And we had the pleasure of hosting Andy earlier in the year as well. And it was a genuinely fantastic conversation. People went away really buzzing about such broad kind of breadth of topics that we covered. And I hope we can talk a bit today about the long-term implications and some of potentially the opportunities as well as the challenges that COVID has presented us. So very briefly, just on a couple of logistics for people. So as I say, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We have a large number of people who are actually in the Zoom call with us, which is fantastic. And you are the lucky people who can ask questions when we open it up to the virtual floor. We also have people watching the live stream on YouTube. So hello and welcome to you guys. I'm sorry you can't ask questions directly, but hopefully you will enjoy it just as much anyway. If you are in the Zoom call and you do want to ask a question, I'm sure everybody's far too familiar with Zoom by this point, but there is a little Q&A button. If you hover your mouse just at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A function. Please put any questions you have for Andy into that. Don't use the chat. We won't be looking at the chat. Make sure you put it into the Q&A. I am going to take chair's prerogative and take about half of the time in asking questions that I at least will find fascinating to hear the answers of, and hopefully everyone else will too. I have done a bit of a sort of reaching out to people to see what others would be interested in as well. And then we will open it up to the questions, as I say. So start popping any questions you have into that Q&A function, and I will make sure that I bring in as many people as possible at that point. So Andy, thank you so much for joining us at what is obviously a hectic period. I wanted to start off with, I guess, a question, just because I think it would be fascinating for people. This is obviously the second major economic crisis that we've gone through in pretty much a decade. This one obviously it has, pretty unprecedented kind of different aspects to if you can ever have a regular recession. When you're sitting in the Bank of England and you can see sort of a tidal wave of shock or crisis coming towards you, what are the processes? How does the bank respond? If we were a fly on the wall, what would we have seen back in sort of January, February, March time?
Thanks, Charlie. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that kind of introduction. Let me say a word about that, Charlie, to kick us off. So these crises are always a bit different. This one was a lot different. Why do I say that? Obviously, size and speed and severity made even the global financial crisis seem relatively modest and slow moving by comparison. It also came at a time when we were changing governor, actually. So I think Andrew Bailey's first week in role was right in the middle of this. So we were changing personnel at the top, which has added a certain something. And of course, we also moved, like the rest of the world did, to doing everything remotely. So we'd gone through, so I said on the Monetary Policy Committee, we'd gone through the better part of 22 years, never having a virtual get together of the MPC. And all of a sudden, we were having one on a daily basis. And that was quite a shock to the system. I mean, I think what really helped, obviously having the kit working helps, but also what really helped in a funny sort of way was having had experience, relatively recent experience of having lived through a crisis. So if we could back up 10, 12 years, because I'm old enough to have been around for a whole multitude of crises now, Charlie, frightening thought as it is. But if I think back 10, 12 years, global financial crisis, truth be told, benefit of hindsight, we had a bit of a slow start, I think. And I think reacting to a crisis, understanding a crisis, sniffing out a crisis is a habit. And responding to a crisis is a muscle. And I think having had relatively recent experience, many of us, of a big crisis, and having had to exercise our crisis muscle, it sort of put us in a somewhat better position this time around when it came to dealing with the COVID crisis, as much as this crisis was very different in its source, obviously, in its speed, in its severity. That kind of nimbleness, that fleetness of footness, that twitch muscle, if you like, in responding with policy to crisis was still with us. I think hopefully served us pretty well. The same, I think, was true among central banks around the world. They too had still had a bit of a crisis mindset, and that left them well equipped. And so to an extent was that true within Treasury departments, including our own Treasury. And I hope those things did combine in bringing about what I think was a pretty, well, not just pretty, very substantial twin package, double-barreled package that comprised both a big monetary element, but as importantly, a big fiscal element. I'd like to think, that our relatively recent crisis experience helped deliver that at speed and at scale in a way that's hopefully served a lot of incomes, a lot of jobs.
And I mean, you mentioned there the sort of twin response, and I guess the fiscal interventions had to perhaps be more sizable this time because there was perhaps less scope for monetary intervention. I suppose I'm thinking in particular the lowering of interest rates, but just focusing on, I suppose, the one of the bigger elements of monetary intervention, which is the QE. And we had obviously an announcement last week of an additional 150 billion of quantitative easing coming in. I think that puts the bank as owning somewhere in the region of 900 billion of government debt now.
A little bit less, yeah.
A little bit less, maybe a few billion less.
Yeah.
What are the implications of that looking forward, both for the economy, but also for public finances?
Mm-hmm. So, as you say, Charlie, this time's monetary response was a bit different. I think back 10, 12 years, then we had a very significant interest rate response, about a 5 percentage point lowering of interest rates. And then we laid on top of that some dollops of QE. That's not a technical expression, dollops of QE, but nonetheless, there were sizable dollops of QE. This time around, interest rates didn't start at 5 and a bit. They started sub 1%, which meant we had less room on the interest rate side. So the balance of the monetary response has been a bit different, a bit more QE, a bit less interest rates. Nonetheless, the response has been very significant. So, think about it. We've announced more QE during the first 10 months of this year than we executed in the 10 years prior to this, right? So this is a pretty sizable response, as you say, just shy of 900 billion pounds of QE. Another difference this time, as we've said, was that was supported and partnered with a fiscal response, which I think was absolutely appropriate. In fact, I'd say The fiscal response this time was very much the frontline response. Given the nature of the crisis, it required a more surgical set of interventions, in the jobs market directly, supporting certain sectors worst affected by the crisis. Those aren't the sort of interventions that the blunt tool of interest rates or QE can carry out. You need a more surgical tool, and fiscal policy was that surgical tool. And we've seen a fiscal response, probably north of 10% of GDP, pretty much unprecedented in peacetime, that was commensurate with the scale of the task ahead of us, monetary and fiscal working in partnership, independently set, but working in partnership. And in a complementary fashion, because one of the primary purposes of us both lowering interest rates and conducting QE was to keep the costs of borrowing in the economy at rock bottom levels, pretty much zero, give or take, right along the yield curve. Of course, that supports fiscal policy because it keeps the cost of borrowing by governments low, but more broadly, it supports the whole economy because the government yield curve is the anchor yield curve for every borrower in the economy, not just governments, but companies and individuals as well. So our role really has been to provide insurance to the finances of every sector of the economy by keeping that borrowing cost at rock bottom levels for as long as necessary to get the economy moving again. That's really been the essence of every action we've taken over the course of the last 8 or 9 months.
And that your comment there for as long as is necessary, I guess, is the most important part almost of the answer. How long is it possible to keep borrowing as cheap as it is? And when we do see interest rates increase, which presumably they will need to do, there will be some fairly serious implications, both, as you say, for the public finances, but also for those businesses that have had to take on an awful lot of debt to get through this period.
Yeah, so on the interest rate question, if you believe financial markets, and they are participants putting their money on the line, then there isn't very much risk of interest rates rising very soon. The fact is the government can borrow for 50 years for close to diddly squat. And to a significant extent, so can blue chip companies. So if you believe at least financial markets, then we are set for a lengthy period of interest rates being very low. Now, of course, things can change, and who knows, things might change. It's important also, I think, Charlie, to put what we're seeing right now in the context of what has been happening now over many, many decades. We've seen over at least the last 50 years a steady but secular fall in levels of interest rates right across the globe. That was true well before COVID struck. Lots of reasons why, if you like, the global level of real interest rates has been trending down. But in essence, that's been about, too large a pool of global savings trying to find a home into smaller pool of investment projects. COVID led to a further notch down, a ratchet down in global levels of real interest rates as people got scared and started saving more and investing less, and widening that imbalance between savings and investment. Ultimately, the reason for saying all of that is because central banks can have some influence over the yield curve, over interest rates short and long. But ultimately, what's driven down interest rates over that period is not down to your local friendly central banker. That's down to the decisions made by the government and by the private sector in how much they save and how much they borrow. And that ultimately will be the arbiter of where interest rates go next. Now, you're right. If it would be the case that market participants were wrong, and if the cost of borrowing were to pick up, then of course that would raise debt servicing costs, both for governments and indeed for companies and households as well. But let's just think of the circumstances in which that happened. That is most likely to happen when people are saving less and investing more. In other words, when the economy is doing well rather than doing badly. That would then be a natural movement up in interest rates, and therefore would run less risk of those over-indebted companies or over-indebted governments getting into financing difficulties.
Thank you. And then a very quick question, because I do, as I said at the start, want to move on to sort of looking into the longer term and some of the opportunities. But we have just had this news about a vaccine. I'm not going to put you on the spot in the sense that I know you won't have had a chance to read the details and know exactly kind of how good things are looking. But let's say that it is promising and that perhaps we will be getting, a vaccine signed off and doses starting to come out, if not before Christmas, then, early in the new year. Let's just take that as our hypothesis. That's a game changer, I presume. What does that mean for your forecasts or your kind of looking forward into 2021 and where the economy, what it might mean for the economy and businesses?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it would be a game changer, Charlie. I mean, where do we sit today? Roughly speaking, economy falls by between a quarter and a fifth. It claws back about a half of that, a bit more than half of that. There's a risk during the fourth quarter that recovery stalls because of lockdown and restrictions. That was a story of our monetary policy report last week. We recognized in there, as anyone would recognize, just what huge degrees of uncertainty were out there. I would say, to even talk of a central path for the economy right now is fanciful. We're in a world of multiple paths being possible, depending upon where the virus goes, where treatments go, and crucially, where vaccines go. Because I do think there would be a game changer economically in the following sense. For sure, they would mitigate and ideally eliminate the health risk once rollout has been completed. And rollout will almost certainly take, even as a vaccine announced today, rollout would take probably several quarters. But I think the very announcement of this, I'm not close enough to know how credible today's Pfizer announcement is, but let's hope it is. That would shift expectations, I think, very decisively among both people and among companies. So, example, last week I was speaking to businesses up in Scotland, and their fearfulness is greatest about, are we entering a period of stop-start? That we open the economy, the virus picks up, the economy is forced to close down, we're forced to close down, and we're in an endless stop-start cycle. And every time we stop, we're required to borrow to tide over the cash flow shortfalls. And therefore, if you go through enough of those stop-start cycles, your business is suddenly unviable. And they were sitting there just not knowing, genuine uncertainty about whether their business is viable, because they didn't know how many stop-start cycles lay ahead. Along comes a vaccine rather than a virus. And at a stroke, you've managed to truncate, lop off that stop-go cycle. Whether it's next quarter or next year matters much less than the fact that you now have a way of preventing the prolongation of this stop-start cycling. And that is all the difference in the world between having a viable business and not having a viable business, in making that investment and not making that investment, in psychological scarring that persists and deepens, or the sense that things are going to get better at some point in the foreseeable future. So I do think and hope, expect that were we to get credible news about that, and I hope we have credible news about that, that could really change the game on people's expectations well ahead of rollout.
Thank you. So looking forward and a kind of bit more broader from just the economy, one of the things that COVID has done is to, if we needed it, re-shine a light on some of the biggest challenges that the country was already facing, and kind of been even more exposed during the pandemic. And I'm thinking of things like intergenerational unfairness. I'm thinking of things like the different layers of inequality, so from health to wealth to geography, and we've seen obviously the virus expose those differences in it, from its impact, but also things like the fraying of the social contract, questions about whether we have a responsible enough model of capitalism. And I always note when I think of having a conversation with you that you are one of the few economists who has talked about morals in kind of capitalism and in sort of behaviours, company behaviours. How far do you think we are at a moment where we could really think about some of the transformative change that could tackle some of those big issues, and perhaps taking inequality as a starting point? What are the opportunities we have, and how might we think about going forward and addressing them, both in a kind of financial inequalities, but also those other sorts of inequalities that I've touched on?
Well, I say, as you say, Charlie, I mean, there's no question along many, if not most, of the dimensions of inequality that you listed. Most, if not all, will have got somewhat worse by dint of the crisis that we've been living through over the past few months. Most of the evidence I've seen suggests a widening of the financial-based inequalities, whether that be income or wealth, a prospective widening of the generational divides, because the young, as ever, will bear the brunt of the recession and the joblessness that will necessarily is likely to accompany it. Those spatial differences you mentioned at a regional, sub-regional level, I think, if anything, are likely to widen. My hope would be that we use the crisis as a catalyst to set about tackling those long-standing fault lines with renewed zeal. That would be my hope. There's many and various things I think would need to happen for that to happen. I mean, one of them that has certainly been sort of brought forward by this particular crisis is how we think about the social contract between business, workers, and the state. I'd say one of the small silver linings from what has been a very, very dark cloud of a crisis has been the way in which the state, business, workers, and civil society have sought to work together in much more of a partnership at these times of stress. We have seen the state stepping up in the insurance it's been providing. We have seen businesses acting in an overtly purposeful fashion to support their communities and to support their workers and their customers and their clients. We have seen civil society stepping up to fill in all of the gaps that we know get exposed at times of economic and societal stress. And at a very broad level, I would like nothing more than that new social contract, that new social compact, to survive beyond the end of this crisis, which I hope is sooner rather than later. I think we'll actually need that to happen. And let me give you an example of why I think that will need to happen, which comes from the way we work. We've seen some very radical shifts in the way we work during the course of this crisis. I sit at home here in deepest, darkest Surrey, having been into the Bank of England only twice in the last 6 months. And about a third of the population is doing likewise. At its peak, about half the workforce was working from home. As best we can tell, some of those changes, not on this scale, but some of those changes will stick around. So how we work will change, and therefore how we do business will also need to change. Many businesses will see great merit in having some of their staff around together some of the time. And that will require a dialogue between business and workers, balancing individual workers' incentives to perhaps have a mixed model of working from home and at work, with business requirements to sometimes being happy with people working from home, but at times needing them in as a critical mass to get things done. That will require a new degree of social partnership between businesses and workers. And the state will be an element of this as well. Because perhaps we don't want people, cramming onto trains at all the same times of day in future. Maybe we just stagger the way we travel as well as the way we work to reduce the risks that we've seen laid bare during the course of this year. So I think on issues like that, pick just one, which is the way we work. I think we might need to look to a different model of social partnership than that which we've had over the preceding several decades.
And just continuing on the theme of how we work and the kind of thinking about these inequalities, I mean, it is striking that, of course, those of us who can work from home tend to be in the slightly more comfortable financially, in more in the sort of professional roles. Is there a danger, therefore, that in maintaining some of the benefits of that, and that there are, as you say, genuine benefits, potentially for productivity, potentially for well-being, etc. But is there a danger that actually that does exacerbate some of the inequalities? And I suppose, in addition, is it particularly problematic for young people? You've talked previously about some of the intergenerational challenges, and young people, I think there is a view, lose out in particular in not being able to come into the office and to have the informal networks, the kind of mentoring, the sort of, the kind of observing kind of life in a workplace.
I think those issues are really important ones, Charlie, and definitely need to be taken seriously. But we've seen some of the divides you mentioned already open up during the course of the crisis. If you look at the patterns of savings across the economy during the course of this year, in general, at an aggregate level, we've seen people saving quite a lot more. But those savings have been racked up exclusively by those on higher incomes, basically, who've saved on the travel card or visiting the theatre or the restaurant while their incomes have been maintained. Whereas for the lower half, perhaps even lower 2/3 income-wise of the population, they entered this crisis with few, if any, savings to begin with. And disproportionately, those are the ones whose either jobs or whose incomes or both have been hardest hit by the crisis. So you're absolutely right that those pre-existing divides have somewhat worsened. This, for me, absolutely puts the onus on providing both short-term insurance and longer-term structural support to people in that situation. The short-term insurance has come in the form of the furlough scheme or self-employment grants of various types. And that is a very important, a crucial sticking plaster solution for those individuals concerned. But as importantly, I think we'll be putting in place the longer term structural solutions for younger people in particular to enable them to acquire the skills and experience to get a first foot on the jobs ladder. Of the risks that are out there economically right now, the one that worries me most is that this crisis has hit hardest those that are young, those have fewer skills, and also it's hit women harder than men, and ethnic minorities harder than whites. And that calls for both this package of insurance, demand side, if you like, and structural supply side measures to prevent us having a lost generation of young workers, people who have the skills to get that first foot on the jobs ladder. Otherwise, there'll be lasting scars, plainly for the individuals concerned, but actually for the economy as a whole.
And you also mentioned, and I'll then go to questions because I can see they're already coming in, but you also mentioned the sort of one of the real positives that we've seen during this period, which is the kind of social solidarity, the kind of, community response. And you wrote a fantastic essay for us, which I will plug and say everybody should go and read our collection of essays. But talking about how important social infrastructure is to actually the resilience of the state and the economy and the nation more broadly. What can we do to make sure that what we've seen in crisis continues into, hopefully, when we get to somewhere closer to a state of normal?
Well, thanks for the plug, Charlie, on the article. Available at good bookstores. I think you're right. So civil society, I don't like calling it the third sector because that conveys the wrong impression. But civil society is one of the unsung heroes of this crisis. To be honest, they are one of the unsung heroes of every crisis, because civil society always steps up to fill those cracks at the time they start opening up economically or societally, and this time has been no exception. I think that the key takeaway for me looking forward is, they shouldn't always be the unsung heroes. We do a better job of recognizing the role of that amorphous mass of charities and community and faith groups and not-for-profits that are absolutely our social glue in good times as well as in bad, and have always been as such. And the reason we had an industrial revolution, the reason the industrial revolution dawned first here in the UK, was because of the combined efforts of the market, the state, and civil society. Each of those three pillars played an equal role in generating that inflection point in our living standards. But often, certainly the third of those is often forgotten about. It's the invisible residual in how we talk about the economy and society. How do we stop that being the case looking forward? Well, the whole bunch of stuff that could be done to improve the foundations, the infrastructure of civil society, of charities and community groups. I mean, a decent starting point would be actually measuring what they do a bit better. Because one reason they are an invisible residual is because they're largely invisible when it comes to how we keep score on how well or how badly the economy is doing. We could do a much better job on the measurement side, moving beyond the traditional metrics like GDP to better recognize the plurality of capitals that make the economy function, not just financial and physical, but as importantly, social and environmental. We need to think afresh about career pathways for people young and old, and perhaps embed civic service as part of our career pathways, young, middle-aged, and old, and to recognize and reward that to a much greater degree. So there's a whole bunch of stuff I could bore you with at length that might be done differently, but the big point is that we'd ensure that, as the market rightly gets lots of policy focus and attention, and the state rightly gets lots of policy focus and attention, that equal focus and attention is paid to that crucial third pillar that is civil society.
Thank you. And it's not boring at all, so do go and read the essay, which does have more ideas in it. Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up to questions. We do have questions already coming in. So I know we've already sort of covered off a couple in our conversation, but one question that I think does link actually to the point about intergenerational unfairness has come in from someone asking about, is there a risk that the monetary intervention, the monetary policy intervention in terms of the quantitative easing may exacerbate it by inflating assets further, and we know that young people have particularly struggled to get on the property market, for example. We know that, you know, young people tend to own stocks and shares much less. So is there a risk that that monetary policy intervention might exacerbate by inflating assets?
Yep. So this is a very fair question. It's not the first time I've had to answer this question, because it was one that was asked even before recent events off the back of our earlier QE actions, and partly because it is such a serious issue, and one we at the bank have taken very seriously. I've done quite a chunk of very detailed research myself to look at the impact of QE, pretty much household by household. Certainly detailed household cohort by detailed household cohort. So rich versus poor, young versus old, north versus south. I've sliced and diced the data every which way, along all the dimensions of inequality that you mentioned, Charlie, to figure out how QE has impacted the balance sheets of different cohorts of society. Has it done that in a way that's exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, whether in income or in wealth? And the short answer to that, which is lucky from my perspective, is that it hasn't. It is true. It is true that part of the way that QE works is by raising asset prices, and therefore that those that are asset rich benefit disproportionately in cash terms. Obviously, they don't benefit more in percentage terms, because it affects everyone the same in percentage terms. That's not widening an inequality, it's maintaining it. But even for those that don't have assets, they too have been the beneficiary of QE, because it has lowered the cost of borrowing in a way that supported jobs. So the rough ready reckon I carry around is, I haven't done the ready reckoner most recently for the most recent dose of QE, but I'm pretty confident, having not done the earlier rounds of QE, going right back to 2009, there would be between 750,000 and 1 million people more unemployed in this country. And disproportionately, that would be younger people with lower skills and lower incomes. So when you do this very detailed slicing and dicing and breakdown, what you find, interestingly, is some of the biggest beneficiaries have been younger, poorer people, because they're benefited most from the rise in the numbers of jobs. Now, that's not often very visible either. You know, it's hard to attribute that uniquely to QE, but as best I can tell, that has been a big boost for them, and therefore overall QE has not been something that has worsened inequalities at any of the levels I mentioned, spatially, generationally, or financially, except for a relatively small subset of individuals. And I can refer you to bits of research that point to that if that's helpful. So it's a very serious point, and one we've taken very seriously. But as best as I can tell, the story is somewhat different than might on the appear of it appear to be the case.
Yeah. Thank you. And then another question which links to the bank buying up lots of government debt. So someone has asked, what is your view of MMT? And are we storing up inflationary pressure for the future? And when you think of the 900 billion, it is a lot of debt that the bank is now owning.
It is. There's no question about that. By any historical metric, that is the largest amount of debt, whether in relation to GDP or in relation. It's obviously true in pounds and pence terms, but it's actually true in relation to GDP. It's true in relation to the fraction of the debt stock outstanding. There's no avoiding that. So people, raising questions about that is a perfectly legitimate. The reason people have ordinarily raised questions about that in the past, of course, is when the central bank has been used as a piggy bank to finance the government. And in many cases, that movie has ended in the same way, in inflationary disaster. That feels some distance away from the situation we find ourselves in at the moment, where I think the vast majority of people, whether it's market participants or economists or business people, would tell you that the risk is, if anything, of inflationary pressures being too low rather than being too high. Indeed, the forecasts we published just last week had inflation just creeping back to just about hit its target in 2 years' time. So I think that the fears that people had in the past about so-called monetary financing stoking up inflation don't really feel kind of fit for purpose in this particular environment. I wouldn't want to dismiss those concerns, but this appears to be the lesser risk given where things are right now. I mean, on modern monetary theory, so-called MMT, I mean, for those who've heard me speak about this before, I have a stock response which runs something like MMT looks good to me except for three things. It's not modern, it's not monetary, it's not theory, which I think, by and large, is probably true. It's certainly not modern because monetary financing of fiscal deficits has been a thing forever. I mean, the history of hyperinflations is the history of that. It's not monetary because ultimately the roots of this are fiscal rather than monetary. And it's also not really a theory, or at least not a proper theory, because it relies, I think, on a one-off or one-shot rise in the monetary stock, and you thereafter being able to sort of hold the line. But history is replete with examples of it being very difficult to make that, to strike that sort of bargain, to say I'll do it once, but I promise never to do it again. That is not something that governments historically have found it very easy to do, especially if it's worked first time around. And in that sense, it's a theory that may work as a one-off, but can't work as a repeated game. So I'd be skeptical about that as a way we should be organizing our economy or policy right now. Do I think that fiscal and monetary arms working independently but in partnership is the right recipe right now? Yes, I do.
Great, thank you. Another question which is about productivity, and someone's reflecting on the fact that one of the legacies of the last crash, and I think sort of implying some of the interventions, is a decade of very long productivity. I mean, I think actually productivity was low pre productivity gap. How do we ensure that we come out of this crisis in a way that might actually boost productivity? And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, I think that actually there is a view that potentially some of the sectoral impacts, the labour market impacts that we've seen during this period, might force people into different jobs that might actually be good for productivity.
I think there's opportunities on that front, Charlie. I mean, there were some headwinds, some clear headwinds to productivity. There were plenty pre-COVID. COVID has added at least two more. One of which is that companies, understandably, given that uncertainty, are not investing right now, and some are not probably innovating right now as well. So now will be a brave time to be putting in place that big investment that transformed the productivity of your business. Now would be a brave time to be investing in that piece of R&D, and therefore that is another of the casualties of the crisis that will have tended to have held back productivity. And a second would be in the jobs market. So, people who would have hoped to have been in work, getting skills and experience, many more will now not be in work. And that too, that skills deficit will have added to the pre-existing skills deficit in a way that is not productivity positive. But let me be positive. I think there are good reasons to think that we could use this opportunity to help tackle what's occasionally in the past been called the productivity puzzle, the productivity problem that the UK and many other countries around the world faced. What would that require? Well, I mean, one important way in which we could build back better is by investing in digital skills and digital kit. That has happened of necessity over the course of the last several months. But we know that going into this crisis, that there was a long tail of companies who had not invested sufficiently in their digital estate, and that was holding back their productivity. We also know that as a country, we'd invested too little in digital skills across our workforce. The events of the past few months have perhaps been a down payment in doing a bit better digitally with our estates and with our digital skills. But frankly, Charlie, is only the start. We could use this as a springboard to upgrade our digital infrastructure, meaning not just broadband, but including broadband, as a springboard to make more inclusive and expansive digital adoption across those long tail of low productivity companies. We'd use it as a springboard to supercharge the digital skill set of the perhaps 50% of our workforce that are currently haven't got the skills they need to survive and thrive in the world of work. So absolutely, if those three things and more besides were put in place, that would be a rocket booster to the productivity performance of the UK. Those are things that could have been done, perhaps should have been done pre-COVID, but COVID has turned a digital priority into a digital necessity for many, many people and many, many businesses. So we may as well make the best of that crisis-based necessity.
And it is striking the underinvestment in the skills agenda more broadly that you were saying, Andy, both public sector investment or state investment in skills, but also business investment, and thinking about the kind of social contract, how we get firms going forward to recognize the value of their staff and invest in their staff in a way that perhaps we haven't seen on the level that other countries see. Another question, which I think is quite an interesting one, and particularly linking to the government's priorities around levelling up an industrial strategy. Someone has asked, are there levers or are there initiatives that the Bank of England could be innovative with that would enable targeting at a regional or a sector-based level, I guess, to boost growth in particular geographies or particular sectors?
So on that, as you know, Charlie, one of my side hustles is as chair of the government's Industrial Strategy Council, thinking about these things. And truth be told, I think when it comes to those more surgical interventions, be they spatial or sectoral, that really does speak to fiscal or structural tools rather than monetary tools or financial tools. Yeah, by and large, with very, very, very few exceptions, the tools of the trade in my day job, at the central bank, aren't, well, I can't set different interest rates for the manufacturing and services sectors. I can't set different interest rates for the north, south, east, or west of the UK as much as I might want to do that. I simply can't. It's technically infeasible. And by and large, that's true when it comes to regulatory policy as well. Now, to be clear, when we're understanding the economy or financial system, we absolutely do it bottom up in a very granular basis. We have agents all around the UK that collect up all this information and feed it all back. But ultimately, when it comes down to pulling the lever, as we did last week with another 150 billion of QE, that's not something we can target to particular spatial or sectoral cohorts. That is, of course, much more amenable to different sorts of intervention. And the levelling up of agenda, I think, is ripe for a refresh in the light of the COVID crisis, not least because we haven't been levelling up over the period since. Interestingly, you know, COVID might well alter on a durable basis the dynamics of cities versus suburbs and towns. So pre-COVID, the forces of agglomeration, of city-centric agglomeration, were incredibly powerful, which is why we saw the emergence of super cities globally and indeed the emergence and rapid growth of a whole selection of cities across the UK. COVID doesn't reverse those agglomeration benefits, but it does dilute them quite a lot. For example, if more people are indeed working to a mixed model of working, then it becomes eminently feasible they might not be living very close to the city centre. They can then live in the satellites and indeed spend in the satellites. And therefore, those a model of still thriving cities, but with thriving satellites, I think becomes much more viable in this post COVID world if where we choose to spend and where we choose to work is somewhat different than it was pre COVID. There's more that is needed, plainly more is needed policy-wise on the levelling up agenda, on infrastructure, digital and physical, on skills, on devolution, most obviously. I live in hope with a devolution white paper coming next year, and doubtless more policies on levelling up that we can kind of make good on that agenda, whose importance and in fact, let me make one more point. I would love it if looking forward we did the following, Charlie. How about if we were framing policy, whatever policy is, every government department in thinking about policy in future needs to run that policy through the lens of, is this contributing to net zero? And is this contributing to leveling up, or at least not making either of those things worse? I think having that as the golden thread running through all of the arms of policy would be one lasting, enduring, and positive takeaway from the the very difficult circumstances of the last 9 or 10 months.
Perfect, and that beautifully, almost intentionally segues to the next question that we have had in, which is around the kind of green agenda. So we know the government is going to be launching green gilts or green bonds. Clearly, climate change is going to be one of those massive challenges that needs urgent attention. So the question we've got is, how do you see the role of the Bank of England in managing climate risk or contributing to tackling climate change?
Yeah, well, I hope we have among central banks played a leading role in the charge to achieve net zero. It was almost a signature issue of Mark Carney's governorship, and will remain absolutely fundamental to what we do under Andrew Bailey's governorship as well. I mean, part of that has been engaging directly with the financial services firms that we regulate, to make sure that they are fully aware of and indeed managing the climate risks that they are facing, not least by dint of the assets that they hold or the contracts that they write. And that is something we've been actively engaged on now over a number of years, and increasingly that has become the norm among central banks right across the planet. I think, Charlie, the bigger prize on that, and a prize that we're getting closer towards, and which Mark Carney in his new role is championing further, is to have the green agenda, net zero, firmly embedded in the decision making right across the investment and financial services industry. Some good progress has been made on that front, but it's by no means fully in the bloodstream. How terrific would it be if by the time of COP26 next year, it could be said to be an absolutely fundamental principle of how private companies go about thinking, how they go about thinking about allocating their capital, in the same way as it's become a central principle of how we think about going about supervising and regulating the firms that we look after. That's a big prize, but I think it's a realistic one. I hope certainly it's one we can realize in the run-up to COP26 next year. And it's certainly one that Mark and Rishi, I think, as I've said today, will be looking to be foursquare behind.
And a final question, because I'm conscious we are running out of time, but to bring it back to the kind of core of, I suppose, what we at Reform, or part of what we at Reform care about, which is the sort of where the spending's going and how we cover the cost of that spending. So we've got someone who's asking about how worried we should be about the level of national debt. I think we've sort of partly covered that off in terms of thinking around borrowing being so cheap and, you know, the kind of the sort of timeline we're looking at sort of any risks to that. But, and I'm not asking you to identify any taxes specifically that we might want to raise, or indeed, exactly. But in general, clearly there is going to be a challenge around the public finances in the coming years, whether that's, you know, kind of 2 years' time or 4 years' time or beyond. Is there an opportunity to think about tax in a different way that might link to some of the inequality challenges that we have discussed today?
I think there is. I mean, I won't attempt to do Rishi's job for him. It's tough enough as it is. He doesn't need me commenting. I mean, I would say that it's important, even on the debt problems, let's get them in some context. You know, it's easy to get overly fascinated by numbers, especially when they hit 3 digits as a fraction of GDP, as government debt now has. But a bit of historical context on that. You know, there were more years during the 19th and 20th century when UK debt to GDP was above 100% than below 100%, right? So there's nothing very unusual about this on the debt stock. What is unusual is how little it costs us to service that debt stock. The debt servicing cost is at historically very low levels, despite the stock itself being at historically moderate levels. Interesting, this year, the cost of servicing that debt has gone down because the fall in gilts has more than offset the increase in the debt stock. The other point I'd make, again, a historical one, there's no normative statement in here, is that the way you lower that debt stock tends to be the most effective way is by growing the denominator rather than shrinking the numerator. That growth is the path to redemption. That underscores the importance of that productivity agenda and that growth agenda that I mentioned earlier on. If you were to think that needs a tax top-up, then you must be right in logic, Charlie, that wouldn't you first reach to tax those things that are public bads rather than public goods? Or in other words, set a tax schedule that supported those golden threads I mentioned earlier on of hitting net zero and therefore taxing pollution and supporting leveling up. As I promised not to comment on tax policy, so I won't, but I've got dangerously close. I should probably stop there.
Thank you, and I did my best to push you slightly further than I know that you would want to, and I think it's perfectly reasonable at this sort of time not to, as you say, start trying to do Rishi Sunak's, the Chancellor's job for him, and perhaps another time we can talk about wealth inequality, etc. But we will save that for another day.
Thank you.
We have. Pleasure. Not least because I would like you to talk for us again. So I'm not going to put you on the spot now. I will wrap up there because we are almost at time. I know there are still a few other questions, and I apologise to anyone that I haven't managed to cover off your question. I think most of them we have picked up in the discussion at some point. But can I say thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Very appreciative of you giving your time, and hopefully it has been both a kind of insightful and enjoyable session to join. It's a kind of very late lunch break. And Andy, can I say a huge thank you to you for giving up an hour in what is an incredibly busy time for you, and for being so candid and willing to talk on such a broad set of topics. As ever, it's been fascinating, and I'm very, very grateful that you have agreed to speak again for Reform. Thank you so much. So I will wrap up then, and I will finish the event. Please do get in touch with us at Reform if you have any other questions or you have any feedback on the event. Otherwise, can I say I hope everybody has a great day, hopefully at least slightly lifted by the vaccine news. Fingers crossed that it is as positive as it sounds. So thank you all so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.